On this episode of China Unscripted, the Chinese Navy is building ships 4 times as fast as the U.S., and the U.S. military may be unprepared. Could China dominate the Western Pacific in the next 10 years? Hi, welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
Joining us today is a very special guest. Captain Jim Fanell is the former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That's the U.S. Navy. And he specialized in the Chinese Navy. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Great. So tell us a bit about your experience, how you know what you know about the Chinese Communist Party's Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy.
Well, I spent just about 29 years in the U.S. Navy, and the latter half of it was all in the Pacific, focused on the Chinese Navy, if you will. And so I had tours at the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters as a mid-level officer, and then went forward to Japan on board our forward deployed aircraft carrier, then the Kitty Hawk. Was also the Director of Intelligence for the U.S. 7th Fleet aboard the USS Blue Ridge. And then I finished up at the Pacific Fleet headquarters as the Director of Intelligence and Information Operations. And in between that, some tours back in D.C., one at the Office of Naval Intelligence as the Senior Intel Officer for China. It was kind of unprecedented to have so many tours in a row consecutively focused on the PRC, and it kind of gave me a different perspective than a lot of my counterparts in terms of kind of an awareness of what was happening in Asia, while most of America and the military defense establishment was focused on the Middle East and, what was going on in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and whatnot.
I definitely want to talk a bit about what you think the Chinese Communist Party's Navy is doing, but one thing I think many people don't realize is that the People's Liberation Army isn't actually the army of the Chinese government. It's the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think that's an important distinction to make?
Yes, I think it is less so today than it was before 2015, when the PLA was really, as you suggest, the PLA ruled all the other services in a way that I think that Xi Jinping has come in and since his reorganization in 2015 and kind of elevated the Navy and the Air Force and the Strategic Support Force and the Rocket Force, and kind of pushed down the PLA in a way and made them equal among many. And I think that has really, we're not totally aware of what all that means yet. But from my perspective, what the Chinese have done is, continue to make emphasis on real substantive warfighting issues, and by making their military not just dominated by a single ground force perspective, they've really become much more of a threat.
How is that?
That's, Shelley, that's because, the ground forces, and I was just, reviewing as we're preparing for this 1 October military parade, and you go back and you look at the previous parades, especially in the Mao years, with this, focus on the People's War and the ground forces and all these ground troops. And you ask yourself, well, if you're an American, what does that mean to me? Who cares if there's a bunch of Chinese people marching across the deserts and in parades in Beijing? It doesn't really threaten the United States. And since 2015, with the elevation of the Navy and the Air Force and the Strategic Rocket Force and the Strategic Support Force, you now have a military that's capable of reaching out and touching Americans, not just at sea in the waters of the first island chain or the second island chain, or their bomber force hitting Guam or things of that nature, our bases in Japan and other places. But now with a rocket force that's building and preparing for hypersonic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles that we'll see displayed on the 1st of October, like the DF-41, or in the cyber domain with the Strategic Support Force and their ability to, influence and upset and disrupt American cyber security. These are all areas now that are being elevated by Xi Jinping in what you would call total warfare. Their approach to looking at warfare beyond just two people standing on a plane with pistols and shooting at each other. It's much more than that today.
Well, so you said you were focused on the Chinese military and navy, while the rest of the U.S. military may have been more focused on the Middle East. Do you think that's changed at all in the past 5 or so years?
Yeah, I retired in January of 2015, and I still, have a strong network of people. I mean, the Pacific is my home, even though I live in Switzerland right now. And what I'm hearing is that from visits to the Pentagon and talking with people in Hawaii and whatnot in the Far East, that we're starting to wake up. We've woke up in some sense to recognize the threat, and we're starting to turn the ship of state, if you will. But it's a very difficult task, and there's still people that want to tell us that engagement is the only solution, and that confrontation won't yield any positive results. And so there's always that dynamic playing in the background. But I think, by and large, people both at the Defense Department and the State Department now, with the appointment of Dave Stilwell as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, we're starting to get more realism back into the government regarding this issue.
Well, so why do you think it's difficult? Why do you think some people do say we should be focused more on engagement? What are they not seeing that you perhaps are?
Well, the engagement school is an old school. It goes back to 1971 when the President Nixon sent Secretary of State Kissinger on a secret mission to China, and we were trying to offset the Chinese in our contest with the Soviet Union. And so at that time it made sense to engage and to open ourselves up to them and to try to draw them out from under the total sphere of the Soviet Union and their control. And so I don't criticize the origins of how the engagement school started, but clearly after 40 years of engagement, where we were kind of told midstream 20, 30 years ago that maybe that when we engage, the Chinese will realize how much better our system was and would start to adopt, the norms and practices of the international community that were created in the post-World War II environment. And we were told that, and we've been told that by everyone in the engagement school, and it was accepted by either party in the U.S. political arena that this would happen. And clearly, by 2012, when you look at like an event like the Scarborough Shoal incident, we can see that there was no truth to that claim that engagement would make China a more responsible stakeholder. It just hasn't materialized. And so now what we're seeing is that this school of thought is being attacked for lack of substance, and there's people on both sides that are trying to argue and make points on whether or not engagement should occur. And I think sometimes what happens is that the people that talk about, hey, the failure of engagement are seen as people that say we want no engagement, as opposed to, and I've written about this, it's about unconstrained engagement, or it's about accountable engagement. And so there's nothing wrong with engagement. You're going to engage with all nations. That's human. That's the human condition. The question is, are you going to engage from a perspective where you actually have tangible measurements of success and failure? And for 40 years, we were told we would have these successes, but then we see the Chinese do things like they did at Scarborough, or what they did in building 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea, or how they treat and encircle Taiwan, or how they speak to Japan, or how they treated South Korea when THAAD missiles were brought into South Korea, or what's going on the border with India. Just all these indicators are, and those are just kind of military hard power issues, not to mention diplomatic issues and economic issues and soft power information warfare kinds of issues, where China doesn't seem to be comporting with the norms that we all kind of thought most nations that were aspiring to have a quote-unquote win-win perspective would adopt.
And just for clarity, when you say the Scarborough Shoal incident, that's sort of the beginning of when China started more aggressively pushing its territorial claims in the South China Sea, correct?
Yeah, there's some debate on exactly when it occurred. I have a close associate of mine who really has outlined this, and I think 2010, when a Chinese fishing vessel rammed a Japanese Coast Guard ship in the East China Sea, could be seen as really kind of the first physical manifestation of this what I call a continuing policy that's just been hidden for many years. But 2012 at Scarborough, I think, is really one of those classic points where, everybody on the West was saying, engage, cooperate, and then China just up and steals, territory from the Philippines inside their exclusive economic zone, and we sat by and did nothing. And China recognized that we didn't do anything, and that for them was like a green light to really ramp up their campaign. And in a way, it empowered Xi to come out of from under Deng Xiaoping's, admonition of, bide your time, hide your weaknesses, don't get out in front of your skis, if you will. And now, there's some discussion about maybe Xi went too fast, too far, but they're in a position of dominance right now in the South China Sea, and then that's in part because we didn't really comprehend what was going on, and we were so enamored with our belief system of engagement that we just couldn't find it in ourselves to confront them about an outrageous act, even against a treaty ally.
You gave a testimony to the House Intelligence Committee in May 2018. In it, you talked about what you call the decade of concern. What is it, and how afraid should I be?
Well, I'm more. You should be afraid always when it comes to dealing with the PRC strategic end state.
Good.
Good. Yeah.
Well, because they've demonstrated that they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. And so my thesis is basically, and I started this back when I was at the 7th Fleet, when we started recognizing where they were headed. And it seemed to me that, stated up front, that China wants to achieve their strategic end states through non-kinetic means. So
what does that mean?
That means using comprehensive national power. So they would prefer to achieve what they would like to see themselves become by using diplomacy or economic pressure or information warfare or soft power or these things that don't involve shooting somebody in the face with a bullet. Okay? So I really believe that's their goal. I mean, it's very much like they talk about Sun Tzu and this, achieving your ends without having to actually physically hit somebody.
Unrestricted warfare.
Right. I think that's what they would like to do. But I know for a fact that the PRC leaders, both Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, have ordered the PLA to have the military capability to take, for instance, Taiwan by 2020, to have the capability to achieve that mission if they were ordered to do so. Well, that comes up in 3 months.
Do they have that ability now?
Well, there's debate about that, whether or not they have it. And I would suggest that maybe they don't have it completely the way we would do it, but I think there's more confidence inside the PLA today than at any other time about their ability to do something like that. So anyway, they've had this order from successive paramount leaders. We don't know what Jiang Zemin gave, for instance. I suspect that he gave a similar order in terms of this idea of taking Taiwan. And when I mention Taiwan, I use that as it's the hardest example of the issues left on the plate for the PRC in terms of restoring what they, the word restore is a dangerous word, to fulfill what they believe is their territorial integrity. They would use the word restore. Many of us would say, well, no, it's not restoring because Taiwan was never part of the mainland in any historical sense. So that aside, China wishes to have Taiwan as part of the PRC. And so the PLA has been ordered to be able to do that starting as early as 2020. So that's the beginning of the decade of concern. And so what's the back end, the 10 years on? Well, I believe that is derived from this notion of what happens in 2049. And as we're all aware, we're watching and reading the Chinese websites, and they're just pumping out this information about this parade that's going to happen on the 1st of October, just 7 days from now, 6-7 days from now. And that parade is for the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the PRC. And they're going, way overboard, many people would say, to make sure that it's the most successful parade ever. And they're going to display all this military hardware, and they're going to show to the world just how strong and powerful the PRC is. So imagine in 2049 what kind of parade they're going to have. It's going to be massive. The 100th anniversary, the dual centennial celebration, 2021 and then 2049. So this event in 2049 will be massive, and whoever is the paramount leader of the PRC in 2049 is going to have to stand in front of the Forbidden City, in front of Tiananmen Square, and stand up, and they're going to, whoever it is...
It'll probably still be Xi Jinping.
He'll have to have some special medicine for that. But anyway...
They're working on it.
Yeah, I heard about that. So whoever it is, though, is going to... can't stand there and say, hey, we're having this big celebration, and oh, by the way, Taiwan's still not part of the PRC. Or, hey, we still got disputed territories with India. Or, hey, the Japanese still have administrative control over the Senkakus. Or you name one of the islands or one of the nations that ring the South China Sea hasn't agreed to such and such, demands over a disputed land feature in the South China Sea. If those aren't all resolved in China's favor, then they won't believe that they've been successful in the great rejuvenation and restoration of the PRC. So the question becomes, if these non-military elements of power, the comprehensive national power, are unsuccessful in achieving the acquisition of all this territory, these guys in the PLA are going to start arguing, let's use force. Let's use force and just take it back. We can do it. We have the power. And as every day goes along from 2020 on, the PLA is going to be more confident in their ability to do this.
Why is it 2020 to 2030, though? Because they have, like you said, till 2049.
So that's the 2030 piece is the real issue. So, and this is open to debate, but my sense of it is, if the Chinese were to invade, for instance, Taiwan in 2045, they know fully that the world by 2049, 4 years later, would probably not all get in planes and fly to Beijing to attend this big ceremony, because people would still have in their mind's eye these pictures of Chinese troops invading an island or whatnot and killing people. So the question is, how far back from 2049 can you go and conduct a military operation and still expect the world to show up at your party? And I believe that there's an example that's already been demonstrated by the West, and that's the time period between 1989 and the Tiananmen Square incident and 2008 at the Beijing Olympics. And you recall in 1989, the world condemned China for what it did. We all saw the tank man. We all, CNN broadcast these images around the world and showed what a kind of a ruthless system the PRC was, and how they didn't even care about their own citizens, that they'd be willing to drive them over with tanks to get what they wanted, which is peace and stability. Okay, so now, fast forward 19 years to August 8th, 2008, and the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. And in those ceremony, if you recall it, was a fantastic ceremony. You had 80,000 people in the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing, and at the top of the stadium, you had the air-conditioned skybox, right? And in those skybox air-conditioned location seats was Hu Jintao and the other 8 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which was 9 people at that time. And they were all in their Mao suits, and they were all cool and calm and collected, and they were looking down on this vast array of humanity, 80,000 people that were sitting out in 95-degree weather, 95% humidity, and they saw one guy. I believe they saw one guy. And the one guy had a suit coat off, had his tie off, had sweat stains under his armpits. And that guy was George W. Bush, President of the United States of America, the leader of the free world. And there were other world leaders there as well. But they saw him, and they realized that in the space of 19 years, The free world went from condemning China as barbarians for what they did to their people at Tiananmen to, getting on a jet and getting their ticket to watch the opening ceremony.
Is it possible that was just George W. Bush's useful rebellion against his father? Dad, you turned on Beijing, so now I'll go to the Olympic Stadium.
It could be that they see that, but I guess that's why I mentioned there were other world leaders there. And so, I mean, the point is, I get your joke.
Thank you.
I'm kind of a blockhead on these things, sorry.
No, Chris had just made what we like to call a Matt joke.
Yeah, well, he's very good at it, and I'm a kind of a dense head here on this thing. So sorry, I should have laughed.
Yeah. No. Well, you still can. I can edit this, make it seem like it was spontaneous.
I'm a blockhead, so it's okay.
Okay. But yes, you were making a very important point, and I interrupted. So
that's also part of a Matt joke.
Yes.
It's good. I like it. I really do. But the point is, you get it, which is to say, we already know that people outside of the West look at America and say we got short attention span anyway, problems. And then when you put it in real terms like Tiananmen to Beijing Olympics, it's not hard to imagine that some people in China are saying, guess what? If we launched an invasion of Taiwan in 2030, those same people in those countries that condemn us in 2030 will be knocking on the door to get their front row tickets to the parade in 2049.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it might not even take 19 years. I remember seeing some, like Dianne Feinstein in 1993 arguing that, we should do business with China. They've definitely learned from their mistakes.
Yeah.
4 years later.
George Bush Sr. had sent, that secret delegation, of which I think Dianne Feinstein might have been part of, to China to start to make good almost immediately after the massacre.
So, I mean, that's a good point, which then you could push the threat of use of force from 2030 to maybe 2035. I don't have this as, it's not written down. Somebody from the CCP didn't mail it to me. So I'm just applying what I think is a rational argument, which is to say there's going to be pressure to use the military tool, and our only hope on our side is to disrupt that plan, which is to how to take them off of that. And part of that includes finally recognizing that we got a problem and that we have to confront it instead of appeasing it. And that hasn't been something that's been popular up until the last 2 years, to be frank.
What do you think the change has been?
Well, I think this president is, he's not beholden to the idea of, well, we always did it this way. I mean, when he hears that, I can imagine when he hears that phrase, well, this is the way we've always done it, it's like an invitation to do exactly the opposite. So, and I have to be honest, in my career in the Navy, that's kind of the way I approach things, which was, and I worked for admirals that were the same way. Just because we've always done something doesn't mean we continue to do it. You have to constantly stop and reassess why you're doing what you're doing. And when it comes to engagement, it's like an area that's taboo. We're not allowed to ask, well, we engaged with them, we invited them to RIMPAC, and what did they do? We asked them to come to RIMPAC, and what did they do? Oh, they sent a spy ship to Hawaii to spy on the exercise, even though they had 4 ships in the exercise in 2014. We invited them to RIMPAC so that they could feel like a part of the nations in the Pacific. And what did they do? They built 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea. I mean, where was the rational assessment from anybody inside the U.S. government that said, whoa, these things are tangible failures, and yet we continue to do the same thing. Maybe we should change. Before 2015, 2016, you are not allowed to say that. You are not allowed to ask those questions.
Why is that?
Because of this, I call it the Kissinger school. The Kissinger school, the acolytes of the Kissinger engagement policy. And there are many of them. And you saw some of them on the 3rd of July write a letter to the president and say, hey, China's not the enemy and you shouldn't confront them. You should appease them. And they didn't write it exactly that way, but that's the gist of the letter. And you had 80, 100 names on that letter that pointed that out. And those are the people that believe this. And they didn't go away after they wrote their letter. In fact, think about it. They wrote the letter in 2019, 3 years after the election. They haven't gone away. They still believe that they're right, and they still want to have their access to Beijing through, accepted visas and their speaking fees and their speaking tours and their conferences to promote, engagement with China.
Who are some of these people? Let's name names here.
They're on that list. I'm not going to go down. I mean, I really don't need to, because I don't think it's a cabal of people that all sit around and talk to each other in terms of, they're in a group and say, we need to do this, this, and this. They all fundamentally, ideologically believe in this. And
emphasis on idiot. Ideologically.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wow, Chris.
Wait, I think we got to cut that one out. I'm sorry.
That one's a stretch, but I got it.
Thanks.
So those people they've been brought into a system that promotes them for thinking this way. They come in as undergraduates. They get inside. They go into a China studies arena. They get mentored by these professors that have been part of the original opening up in the 70s. And then they're, indoctrinated into this way of thinking. They're shown this is the way you do things. This is the way you talk about China. This is how you get access. If you say the wrong things, you'll lose your access. You can name famous people that were, brilliant China scholars. This Perry Link, if you will, a guy that was brilliant now can't go back. I mean, so there's examples there of the carrot and the stick from China, and that's how we've trained these people. And then they go into government at some point, and they rotate back into their think tanks or their groups, and it's incestuous. And anybody that ever spoke out against them was, considered a wild-eyed radical.
Is that, I can see that happening in the diplomatic or, like you said, think tank circles or academia. Is this a problem in the military as well?
Yeah, I would say that the military is no different than the rest of the U.S. government and the rest of the intelligentsia. These people that become the leaders of our military grow up being briefed and advised by these people. These people inhabited positions in their national intelligence community, in our senior, State Department positions, in our senior government, funded organizations and think tanks. And so if you're a junior officer in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy and Marine Corps, and you experience this and you hear these briefings and you go to some of these seminars, and then you come back and you get promoted and you go up the chain, and then you see that when people speak out, they get hammered for speaking out. Well, it's no wonder that the senior leaders would also be susceptible to the same kinds of thinking. Now, the other side of that, though, is because the military is a little bit separated. Once you have a change, like a new president, like President Trump, who's breaking from the mold of both Democrats and Republicans over the last 40 years, there is a chance for these new leaders to recognize, well, we actually are beholden to the Constitution. We take an oath to, support and defend the Constitution and the President of the United States. So if we have a new president that's saying we have to question what China's doing and confront them, you're bound to get a little bit more, like they say in baseball, a little bit more movement on the ball. So I think there's been some more development in moving forward with confronting China's bad behavior in the DoD than maybe the other elements of our government, simply because they're more disciplined in their approach to responding to directions from the president.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. So, the PLA hasn't been in an armed conflict since a brief war with Vietnam in the 70s. Now, over the past couple of years, the Communist Party has been spending big to modernize the military in terms of battle readiness. But really, because of that lack of combat experience, is the the PLA really that much of a threat?
I would say yes, simply because combat experience is just one element of overall combat capability. And so, while the United States has had 30 years of war, I was talking to someone this last week. I mean, we're coming up on, 1990 and Desert Shield when Iraq invaded Kuwait. So essentially, since 1990, we've had, or 91, if you will, we've had troops deployed into the Middle East in large numbers. And over that period of time, we transformed the Department of Defense into a department that was focused on fighting war over land in the Middle East against nations like Afghanistan and Iraq and things in Syria and Libya and whatnot. But we haven't prepared and built a U.S. military that's ready to fight a peer competitor in the middle of the Pacific. Now, when I joined the U.S. Navy back in the mid-'80s, we were focused on the Soviet Union and a global Soviet Navy. And so we had prepared a naval force that was Secretary of the Navy John Lehman's, maritime strategy, a 600-ship Navy, and the tools and the training and the capabilities and the maintenance and all of that to go into defeating the Soviet Navy at sea. And then we walked away from that after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and then we got off into these Middle Eastern wars. So we haven't, in our own sense, been combat tested in war at sea for 30 years as well. So, I mean, yes, we have a Navy that stays at sea, and there's something to be said for being at sea. That's something that has always separated the U.S. Navy from other, at least in the post-World War II era. Being at sea for extended period of time on your warship is a huge training value and a huge combat readiness element, but it's still not combat. And so we have to, we should never be more sure of ourselves just because we can look at somebody and say, well, you didn't fight in a war since 1979 and that wasn't a naval war. That's true, but either have we. And when I look at that fact, plus the fact that over the last 5-10 years, China has outproduced the U.S. Navy in number of warships 4-1. So they get 4 times as much production out of their $220 billion a year in defense spending, while we spend $700 billion plus. They get 4 times as much product. And their product is substantially better than ours in many ways. Not in every way, but in many ways. And one of the ways is anti-ship cruise missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. The Chinese have invested billions into developing anti-ship cruise missiles that have longer range than the United States, on the order of 200 nautical miles. We're under 100 nautical miles, and that their missiles fly at supersonic speeds. Ours fly at subsonic speeds, which means they're harder to defeat when they're coming in at you. And thirdly, there are high G maneuvering. They can pull high gravitational forces to evade defense in-close weapon systems where ours can't. And they built these to be launched from submarines, from surface ships, from bomber aircraft, and from land-based brigades and regiments. So we're getting volumes of missiles coming in from the air, from, on the surface, from under the water. And we're also getting now, talk of this new hypersonic missile technology, which places another dynamic into the defender's mindset of how do I defend against these supersonic ASCMs, plus the anti-ship ballistic missiles like the DF-21 and DF-26, and now hypersonic missiles. So, and then you do that in a complex electromagnetic environment where they're blanking out or trying to blank out our satellites, so we lose situational awareness. They're jamming our ships with electromagnetic pulses and waves and things of that nature to defeat our communications and early warning detection systems. They've sculled all this through. They've studied this. They've developed this. And while they haven't actually pulled the trigger to kill somebody in hostile engagement, I can tell you that they practice these things in their home waters using all of their joint services to attack targets at sea.
Wow, this is terrifying.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're not 10 feet tall. I mean, I have to always back this up with they're not invincible, but we have to respect and honor the threat and not just poo-poo it. And that's been my beef over the last 20 years plus is we kind of just ignored it and said, oh, there's nothing there. Just like we said, oh, they're not doing anything down in the Spratly Islands. Don't worry about that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's 7 islands there now, and 3 of them are the size of Pearl Harbor. Oops. I mean, that doesn't cut it anymore.
So is the Chinese military able to rival the United States military now, in 5 years?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean. Rival globally? No, not today. But are they able to dominate the first island chain? I think we're very worried about that. I mean, they have these ballistic missiles, these carrier killer missiles, which is their terminology, not my terminology. So, I mean, they develop missiles to kill carriers, the DF-21D and the DF-26. 21 goes out through the first island chain, the DF-26 can reach Guam. And
So which is the first island chain?
Oh, sorry. First island chain, I always get that question. Is there anybody left on the planet that doesn't know? Maybe so. You can cut that out.
Well, just tell us.
That first island chain is the islands that go down from the main islands of Japan through the Ryukyu Islands to Taiwan, and then down to the Philippines, Luzon, and down there into Singapore, if you will. That's essentially the first island chain. The second island chain runs from essentially Tokyo Bay through the Bonin Islands, down through Guam, and then down into the Maluku Islands of Indonesia, which is a farther chain, another 1,000 miles out from the first island chain. So the first island chain, you think in your head, about 700 miles from mainland China, and then the second island chain is another 1,000 beyond that.
So basically China's ability to dominate the Pacific.
Well, the western half of the Pacific. I mean, it's still then from Guam to Hawaii, another 2,000 miles or so. So, I mean, it's the western, what we used in the old term in the Navy called the Westpac, the Western Pacific. So they want to dominate that area and expel us, at least expel us from having military influence and dominance. And part of that desire means to be able to sink and destroy U.S. aircraft carriers, which is still our main element of our forward deployed military presence. Now we have bombers in Guam, and we have submarines in Japan and in Guam, and we have Army forces and Marine forces and Air forces that are stationed throughout Japan and other areas. But in terms of what the Chinese need to be able to do in order to achieve that objective of taking Taiwan, they have to keep the U.S. 7th Fleet and our aircraft carriers from being able to influence their invasion plan. We call it anti-access area denial. The Chinese call it counter-intervention. They want to counter the intervention of the U.S. Armed forces into disrupting their invasions around and into Taiwan or the Senkakus or the lower South China Sea. So that's why they developed all these weapons, is essentially to push us all the way back outside of that ring of the second island chain, 2,000 miles from China. If they can keep us out of there, they know that they have a better shot of successfully taking Taiwan.
How far away do you think they are from doing that?
Well, that's just this decade of concern. I think over the next 10 years is going to be the real test of whether or not they pull the trigger. And the challenge for us is to be able to disrupt that plan that they have in their head and their scientific development planning of, okay, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. They've done exactly this, this, and this as we predicted. Their defense spending's gone down or up or whatever it is. They've calculated all these factors, and then they're essentially rolling the dice saying, okay, we calculate all this, time to go. And that time, I think, is going to be around 2030. Could give or take. I don't think it'll be much earlier. It could be. So we have to be prepared for that. But it could be 2030 to 2035. I'm not positive on it. But the point is, at some point, if they can't get Taiwan back through diplomatic or economic pressures, someone's going to stand up and tell and it will be Xi Jinping, Xi, it's time to go. Let's pull the trigger. We can keep them at bay. We can keep the 7th Fleet away. And we have the power now to invade and get what we want.
Man, if they're able to do that, if I were India, I'd be very worried.
Well, yeah, because there's other elements there along the Indo-Sino border that, exactly how will that go? And will the Chinese, what's their strategy for that? I think at some point the PLA also has orders to take these as well.
The disputed territories between China and India, you mean?
Correct.
Okay. Well, so, decade of concern, you mentioned there are steps the U.S. can take to deal with this. What are those?
Well, I think, as I've written and testified, I think the first thing is we have to admit that we got a problem. And so
It's like AA.
Exactly. I think we've started to admit that China is a problem. Most of the stuff that I hear from the administration is positive. The Secretary of State, the former Secretaries of Defense, and the current Secretary of Defense, former national security advisors have all spoken out about China's military actions and military capabilities. The president's focused on the economic front, obviously. So we have to. We've kind of stood up in these core documents: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Indo-Pacific Strategy report that just came out earlier this year. All speak to the fact that China is a strategic competitor. That was a good first step. There's more things that can be done in this arena of information. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 called for the Department of Defense to call out and report on Chinese bad behavior in the South China Sea. Well, I haven't seen one of those reports yet. I would like to see the Department of Defense do more to speak out about the bad behavior of the South China Sea. For instance, this week, we're getting reporting from the Philippines that China once again is interrupting the resupply of food and water to 9 or 10 Filipino sailors and Marines on board a grounded ship called the Sierra Madre in Second Thomas Shoal, just 60, 70 miles off of the coast of Palawan, the island, one of the major islands of the Philippines down in the South China Sea. Clearly within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, just 60, 70 miles off their coast. And China is now essentially disrupting the Philippines from being able to bring food and water to 9 sailors that are sitting on a old World War II ship that they got from the United States, an amphibious ship that's literally from World War II that the Filipinos ran aground in 1999. The ship it's rusted. It's a hazard to even be on it, and the Philippines keep these sailors and Marines on board for the last now 20 years, in order to help them maintain their legal claims over jurisdiction over what they consider to be their exclusive economic zone. They had to resort to them grounding a ship and keeping guys on the ship in order to, achieve their national goal. They didn't have a big military. So the Chinese tried to disrupt resupply back in 2014 when I was still on active duty, and they did it again last year, and now they've done it again this year. Why are we not speaking out about this and exposing the PRC's violations of the 2002 Declaration of the Code of Conduct that China signed? Now, it's a non-binding agreement, but China continuously talks about they're working with ASEAN to develop a new code of conduct, and that we're going to see it signed sometime in the next year, they tell us.
Well, to be fair, everything the Chinese Communist Party signs is to them a non-binding agreement.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But they signed the 2002 declaration, and it's got several stipulations, and in one of those it says, hey, we won't harass and bully and threaten the lives of other people that are involved in these disputes. Yeah.
That's not a joke, Matt.
Oh, that was serious. They promised that. Okay.
So I guess, I know that I understand there's a issue with President Duterte and his relationship with the United States, and I got that. But that doesn't preclude the United States from pointing out the fact that China is violating the 2002 DOC and their draft code of conduct they're working on now, and exposes their true strategic intent, which is to say, we get to take whatever we want, even if you think it's yours, and we're going to do it because we're bigger than you. That's China in the South China Sea. Well, we should be exposing that. The 2016 ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration about the Philippines case regarding the 9-dash line. We talked that up. I give the previous administration credit for helping push the Filipinos not push, that's probably too strong of a word, but helping to facilitate the Filipinos' case in front of the court. But then after the ruling came out, the Obama administration went Nordo, no radio. They quit talking about it. Why? Why aren't we talking about China's bad behavior? That's something we could do. You asked for other things that we could do. Other things we could do is we have to spend more on defense, but it has to be defense dollars that are spent wisely to help us bring back our capability to fight and win a war at sea, to defeat the Chinese invasion fleet that would come across. We're making strides there, but I'm not sure it's enough, and in time, in this 10-year window that we've been talking about. We have also issues with China in terms of their ballistic missile submarines. Okay, they're going to put on display next week the DF-41, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile. Well, they're also going to have at the parade the JL-3. I believe we will see that. And the JL-3 is the next generation of their submerged submarine-launched ballistic missile, the JL-2. This JL-3 will now give their ballistic missile submarines the capability to range the United States of America from their home waters.
Are you talking about the continental U.S.?
Continental United States. So this JL-3 is going to have a 10,000 mile plus, or 10,000, I don't know if it's 10,000 kilometer, you have to check me on that, 10,000 kilometer range or more. It's more like 12 to 15 is what I'm hearing. And if that's true, which I don't doubt that it is, that will then allow a submarine in the South China Sea or even in the Bohai to be able to reach a large part of the continental United States.
But that would just be California, right? So it doesn't matter as much?
I'm from California, watch it.
So are Matt and Chris, so I don't know why.
But we live in New York now, so we're safe,
okay,
right?
now you're East Coasters.
We're completely safe from any
Actually,
threats.
it's been in my mind, all these people going east, but that's interesting. I guess I'm in Switzerland, so what can I say?
You went very east, or very west, depending on how you look at it.
So the JL-3 is another thing that we need to be talking about as a nation of how do we hold Chinese ballistic missile submarines at risk? Some people will say, well, we never held every Soviet ballistic missile submarine at risk during the Cold War. And I would say, well, we didn't hold every one of them, but the Soviets had a very rigorous and disciplined process for moving submarines into this, what they call combat duty status, which is the highest level of readiness, which was when a submarine was either at pure side or on patrol and within minutes could fire off the ballistic missile against the United States. We understood that, and was part because we had engagement and dialogue with the Soviets to understand some of their nuclear command and control doctrine. But it also came from great intelligence work that we understood the variations and the gradations of the Soviet nuclear thresholds and doctrines for employing weapons. Okay, we don't have that with the PRC today. They have been very, very opaque and resistant to talking about these things. And so therefore, we have to consider when a Jin-class submarine puts to sea that it may be pointing its missiles at the United States. And we should have in place a capability to destroy those ballistic missile submarines on a moment's notice. I don't think we're there yet.
I want to ask about other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've mostly been talking about the U.S. military and versus the Chinese
Wait, sorry, there are
Navy.
other countries?
Well, I mean, well, this is the question, right? Because the U.S. works with other countries' navies in the Pacific, do you see the same type of change in understanding the Chinese Navy and what they could do from the militaries of these other countries?
That's a great question. It's a really important question because we don't go it alone. We can't go it alone in the Pacific. And I would say that where we're at today is we have some nations that are responding, but all of them fundamentally, in my experience, and I was, like I said, I was out there for many years, and I dealt with my counterparts in all these countries that are in the Pacific. At one level, they all know what we failed to talk about or acknowledge, this thing about acknowledging you got a problem. They all recognize that if China is the top dog and really in power and they got the biggest military, it's going to be a different world than it's been for the last 80 years. And they're not keen on that. But they're also not going to, go out and say that in public for fear of the blowback. So there's this kind of, tension there about getting people to speak up about the threat from China, but also not, losing money and investments and dollars, and also being threatened militarily. So one of the things that the Chinese or the U.S. needs to do and continue to do is to speak out about China, and by doing that, it empowers these other nations to be more willing to speak up and out as well. What you've seen in a place like Japan, for instance, is Prime Minister Abe's been much more vocal about the need to build up the Japanese self-defense force and to, change restrictions like Article 9 in their constitution to give them more ability and authority to take proactive measures to defend themselves.
I mean, but that was the U.S. who made them put that in their constitution.
Yeah, I mean, that's from General MacArthur and the Constitution that we developed from them after World War II. So, we could spend, another couple hours on talking about Japanese domestic politics, but suffice it to say, the Japanese people recognize that China is a threat, and they're more inclined now to spend more money to defend themselves and to empower their military to do more things with the U.S. to work together to partner to defend against China's intentions. But we haven't had success in every area. I look at, for instance, Thailand. Thailand had been an historic ally of the United States. It's our oldest treaty ally in Asia, 150 plus years, 157 years. Okay, and because of our neglect during the years of the rebalance to the Pacific, even though it sounded good, we basically neglected some of these nations. And in fact, when Thailand had a coup in 2014, a non-violent coup, the previous administration essentially said, well, we can't deal with them. And so we're going to kind of shut down a lot of the engagement. We're going to restrict what we do with the Thailand. And what we see now, 5 years later, is Thailand has rushed into the arms of the PRC. They're buying submarines from China. They're going to buy surface ships. The economic engagement is stronger than ever. And we burned an ally in Southeast Asia through our own neglect. You could say the same thing about the Philippines. Even though President Duterte has a long track record of anti-Americanism dating back to the 70s, I don't think he'd be such a vociferous critic of the United States had the United States stood up in 2012 and pushed back on China over Scarborough Shoal. But we didn't do that, and there's a lot of people in the Philippines that, felt like they were betrayed by the United States.
Did Benigno Aquino want the U.S. to support them at that time, and the U.S. just refused?
Well, it's a long, complicated story, but essentially the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell, was our lead negotiator with the Chinese side, which was Madame Fu Ying, and the Philippines Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And basically, Kurt Campbell said thought he had an agreement with the two parties that they would both leave Scarborough Shoal at the same time in 2012, in June of 2012. And on the day, June 15th, when they were supposed to leave, the Filipinos dutifully left per the agreement, and the Chinese didn't, not all the Chinese. And since that day, since June 16th, 2012, China has had sovereign control over the Scarborough Shoal. And Filipinos look at us as, some Filipinos have looked at us as that we were completely incompetent, which I think is true. But they also, some of them, wonder whether or not we had some kind of deal with China. I don't know that. But the fact of the matter is the Philippines said, hey, we're a treaty ally, you should be helping us, and you didn't. In fact, it made it worse. We lost the Scarborough Shoal. Now, since then, the Chinese have been, quote unquote, gracious and allowed Filipino fishermen to fish around the outsides of the shoal, but never to go back really in and fish. So it's a mixed bag, but the residue of this is just another signal about China or America's commitment to its allies. And so I find it almost ironic that in this administration, people are criticizing the president's comments about allies and friends and neighbors. And I understand people making those criticisms, but what I don't understand is where were all those same people when we did nothing in 2012 at Scarborough, or we did nothing in, from 2012 to 2015 when China built those 7 islands. We did nothing and said nothing. We were told, stay away. We can't get involved. And so if we're going to have allies, then we have to work overtime to keep them. I've been married 31 years. I mean, you want to stay married, you have to work at it. You have to, you have to invest time and effort and attention into your partners. And we didn't do that. And it didn't just happen in the last 2 years. In fact, I would say in the last 2 years, there's evidence that we're investing more time and effort to really build substantive relationships with our allies and partners. But there's a lot more to do.
But I thought the whole Trump administration ethos was America first.
I think America first is a phrase that doesn't exclude working with allies and partners. That's how it's framed in the press. But I mean, when I see the secretaries of defense that we've had and the secretaries of state and the Indo-Pacific commander and our service component chiefs all out there, engaging and doing more with our partners in Asia. I mean, just look at, for instance, a couple of issues. How about non-freedom of navigation operations, those, much ballyhooed FONOPs? The FONOPs that occur in the South China Sea, we've been doing those since the 70s, since the U.S. established a freedom of navigation program, a FON program, that we do around the world to challenge excessive baseline claims that are not in accordance with international law. Okay, we're still doing FONOPs in the South China Sea, and they get a lot of attention. But since the Trump administration's come in, we've ramped up other military naval operations in the South China Sea that are not inside 12 nautical miles of a disputed territory. They're just in the South China Sea. And we've done them with the Japanese, we've done them with the British, we've done them with the Australians. We've had, in terms of the Taiwan Strait, this year we've had a number of Taiwan Strait transits, about one a month, and we're starting to see foreign navies transit the Taiwan Strait. Canada, France, England. So we're bringing in other nations that were reluctant to do things in the past because they actually physically see that we're putting our money where our mouth is. And so while this administration has the one, America First bumper sticker that people talk about, and they don't have a pivot to the Pacific bumper sticker or rebalance to the Pacific bumper sticker, in terms of what's actually going on in the water, we're actually doing more to assert the things that we stand for.
It's interesting with America First, right? Because sometimes you need a little me time, right? And when you can really, focus on yourself and get a little me time, then you can make your relationships better as well because you have that energy.
You took back the Matt joke, Matt.
I've taken it back. It's all downhill from here, guys.
Oh, I see. It was like a relationship. I got it. Yeah.
Yes.
Work on yourself first. Is that
right?
What? Okay.
Yeah. Well, so, or did you have something more you wanted to say about that?
No, not at this point.
Now that I've totally derailed it.
Okay. Well, so Jim, this is something I always hear people say, like, why should we be concerned about China? The United States military is the biggest threat to world peace. Why should we begrudge China what the U.S. has done? So what do you say to that argument?
I would say that America isn't perfect. I don't think anybody's ever claimed that we're perfect. But we still stand for principles and values that are what I consider to be, and what the Constitution calls, inalienable rights. Rights that are given to us that, that no government can take away. And we stand for those rights. And we try to implement those rights where where we've been involved, and we haven't always done it correctly, and we have had periods where people say we can make everybody be a democracy, and I'm not promoting democracy for all, but what I am saying is that the values of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the right to religion, the freedom of not being invaded by your government and searching your house or stationing troops in your house, and all these things that compose America's history, we have fought for those things. And while we haven't been perfect, people trust those. We have been the city on the hill, and that may sound Pollyannish, but you still have millions of people that want to come to America because they believe in the ideals and the principles. No one is beating the doors down to rush into China. I mean, nobody wants to have, live in a country where there's organ harvesting, or where they put 3 million people in prison camp just because they're Muslim, or they, Hanify Tibet because they don't like the religious leader in Tibet, or they do a whole number of things of preventing you from having access to the information and the ability to speak or the ability to have free assembly. So these principles are different. And so when we asked about what we can do to help, do things to confront China, one of the things we need to do a better job is talk about our principles, talk about our values that we stand for, and that's what really people should trust in. And yes, we've gone off the track in other places, and we've expended a lot of precious blood, sweat, and tears in areas that maybe we didn't need to. And history will judge us for that. But that's not to say that China won't be on the orders of magnitude worse, because we know what they did in their own internal history with their own people and what they're doing today.
Do you think America can make that argument now and be believed?
We live in a very skeptical age. We've got a lot of issues going on at home in terms of internal debates and struggles. It looks bad to the international community. I live in Switzerland now for the last almost 5 years, and to watch how America is portrayed on our own press that's broadcast here in Europe, it doesn't look good. And so we have a huge problem in front of us as Americans, and we need to come together. We need to get back to our founding principles. We need to have a little bit more tolerance and understanding. And I'm just not sure where we're going to go, but I'm not giving up on America, and I hope to come back someday. I'm taking care of my wife's 92-year-old mother. She's going to be 92 in December. So America's still the best place in the world. I love Switzerland, but America's still the best place in the world. We have the best values, and we just got to quit tearing at each other. And we got to recognize that if we don't start getting our act together, that China is coming for us. And they want to knock us off the pedestal. They want to make their currency the number one currency in the world. They would like to see nothing more than to have our economy tank while theirs stays high. That's what they would desire. And I think our president recognizes that and isn't going to allow that to happen without some kind of confrontation. No one wants a war. No one wants an open conflict. But if we've learned anything from history, when we sit passive and do nothing, regimes that don't share our values tend to reach out and do bad things.
I think just maybe one or two more questions. It's clear that the Chinese military has a focus on Taiwan, but with the recent protests in Hong Kong, do you think that will affect the Chinese military's focus?
I think we saw in the last year, right, that People's Armed Police got resubordinated under the People's Liberation Army. And so I think in a sense, yes, that the PLA will now, in an effort to try to maintain control in a place like Hong Kong without appearing to be like they were in 1989, they're going to try to develop and exploit the very latest in, riot control measures and procedures and weapons and technology. And so you're going to see more of that blurring the lines between hardcore PLA warfare, tanks and ships and bombs and things like that, and the People's Armed Police that are, marching in phalanxes down the street with, batons and plastic shields and rubber bullets and tear gas and water cannon and all that. And so I think that the Chinese are using Hong Kong as a learning tool. I'm not sure exactly how that can be ported into Taiwan, for instance, in the event that they actually do try to invade and take Taiwan. I think at that point it's going to be rather, brutish and more classical military operation. But certainly in Hong Kong right now, they've showed extreme restraint. Some people may get upset using that word extreme, but they've showed restraint in terms of what they could do. All bets are off after 1 October, in my opinion.
Horrifying.
And kudos to you all in China Uncensored for going over to Hong Kong so many times and personally risking your lives to report on what's going on. I salute you guys for that. It's huge, and that's a great effort, and I thank you for it.
Wait, we were risking our lives?
I figured you'd like that.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely thank you.
I mean, we were risking much less than Hong Kong people. So
that's for sure. Yeah. I guess the final question then is: can there be a peaceful resolution to the differences between the U.S. and China, or perhaps more accurately put, the U.S. and the Chinese Communist Party?
I think so, but it's going to require us to tool up, be prepared, speak out, engage our allies and friends, confront China's bad behavior at every point, and to not give them any quarter, and to make them go back and recalculate and rethink whether or not the risk is worth the squeeze. And they may end up doing that, but I think we still have a chance to deter them. That's what this is all about. We've been having a discussion in large part about deterrence. We need to deter China from taking these kinds of actions, especially when you talk about the 7.5 million people in Hong Kong and 23 million people in Taiwan.
All right. I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor.
So if somebody listening wanted to know more about you or what you do, where should they go?
I have no social media. So I have this is probably a terrible answer, so you may have to cut this. But the only thing I have is this Red Star Rising that I've been doing for 15 years. And so if somebody's really interested they can contact you all, and you guys can pass them to me, and we can try to add them to the Red Star Rising.
The email list.
Yeah. I'm a Luddite.
Smash the computers. All right, great. Well, it was wonderful talking to you. And thank you to everyone listening. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganejda.
Talk to you next time.